The long-awaited Fantastic Beasts sequel, The Crimes of Grindelwald, opened up this past weekend, giving fans our first appearance of fan favorite Albus Dumbledore, played by the fantastic Jude Law, all the way back in his heyday. I mean, look at him, that is one sexy-ass Dumbledore. I always wanted to go to Hogwarts, but now I have an additional reason to want to be sorted into Gryffindor, if you know what I mean. Yet, despite announcing Dumbledore's gayness over a decade ago, and Dumbledore's love interest Grindelwald literally being the titular character of the film, Rowling and the filmmakers still refused to make Dumbledore explicitly gay in this film's story. Instead, Rowling and the director David Yates opted to queerbait, tiptoeing as close to the line of revealing Dumbledore's queerness without actually saying it. So let's break down what queerbaiting actually is, why it happens, and how it appears in Rowling's wizarding world. It's time to nerd out. Queerbaiting has a long history within Hollywood. In the very early days of Hollywood, on-screen homosexual representation was actually not uncommon. Take the same-gender kiss at the end of Best Picture winner Wings. That all changed, however, with the creation of the Will Hays Hollywood Production Code of 1930. The Hays Code consisted of 36 rules, limiting certain characters and behaviors that religious groups consider to be morally corrupt. This included activities like the understandable sexual assault and violence, but also what was known as sexual perversion, a well-used code for homosexual activity. After the Hays Code came into effect, filmmakers who still wished to showcase LGBTQ characters had to rely on veiled stereotypes and coding in order to simply imply a character's sexuality or gender identity. For example, as Medium writer Sophie Cleghorn points out, in The Maltese Falcon, an explicitly gay character from the book's version is portrayed with a flamboyant voice and body language and given phallic imagery in the film version. Ah, phallic imagery. We never can get away from it, can we? Gotta have penises everywhere. These stereotypical, over-the-top representations of queer people eventually became more associated with villains due to their cartoonish nature. Think of how Ursula from The Little Mermaid is given the traits of a drag queen, or how the Joker puts on lipstick while discussing how much he loves Batman. However, today, with queer representation once again becoming more sympathetic, and the LGBTQ community becoming more vocal about problematic portrayals of the community, queerbaiting has become a more socially accepted tactic. So what is queerbaiting? TV Tropes defines queerbaiting as, quote, a media work's attempt to lure an LGBTQ fanbase with either false hints of representation or stereotyped, non-essential LGBTQ characters. Essentially, queerbaiting is an attempt by creators to have their cake and eat it too. Creators play up a character's potential queer identity, or more often, a potential queer romance, because they know it will get LGBTQ viewers excited to continue watching the show. And creators want to cultivate an LGBTQ fanbase. Shows can often live or breathe based off of queer fan bases. The Star Trek franchise was saved in part by queer women who fell in love with the potential of a Kirk and Spock homosexual relationship, long after the series was canceled in 1969. And boy, did they find potential in that relationship. One look at fanfiction.net will tell you that. That's not a knock against fanfiction, by the way, because at least a few of those stories were written by me. Today, a significant portion of the vocal fanbase of the Wynonna Earp series is made up of fans of the explicitly queer relationship on the show. So fostering an LGBTQ fanbase can have clear positive impact on a show's success. Yet creators also often fall into the antiquated belief that showing explicitly queer characters can have a detrimental effect on a show's bottom line. On a previous Nerd Out, I outlined how film studios are hesitant to showcase LGBTQ characters due to a variety of factors, from worrying about hurting Chinese box office returns or boycotts from domestic anti-LGBTQ groups. Yet these mindsets are outdated, as queer representation has proven numerous times to not hurt a film's bottom line. In fact, many times queer representation actually helps propel a movie to further mainstream relevance. Yet, sadly, what we often end up with is the unfortunate middle ground of queerbaiting. Take this trailer for the TV show Sherlock, for example.
What's the very worst thing you can do to your very best friends? Tell them your darkest secret.
I love you.
The clear implication of that trailer is that Sherlock will reveal his love to his very best friend, Watson. Yet that never actually happens in the Sherlock show itself. So there's a clear intent to mislead the audience in order to stoke the fires of an LGBTQ fanbase. Some other prominent examples of queerbaiting are Castiel and Dean in Supernatural, as well as both Betty Cooper and Veronica Lodge, and Archie Andrews and Joaquin DeSantos in Riverdale. I'm still rooting for you, Destiel. So what does all this have to do with Harry Potter? Back in 2007, several months after the release of her final Harry Potter book, J.K. Rowling shocked the world by revealing that Dumbledore was indeed gay. At the time, this certainly was an important revelation? This certainly felt like an important revelation. Jesus, I can't say it. At the time, this certainly felt like an important revelation due to the lack of queer representation in children's literature. Today, however, it feels like retroactive queerbaiting. J.K. Rowling was able to get the praise and accolades for being inclusive without actually having to do the work of including that representation in her actual books. Despite Rowling's proclamation of gayness, Dumbledore would remain an aloof, asexual father figure in the books. It's not like she could go back and change the books retroactively. So it was actually extremely exciting when J.K. Rowling announced that she was going to make a film series called Fantastic Beasts, featuring Dumbledore's tragic fight with his childhood love Grindelwald. Finally, queer fans might actually get the gay representation that they longed for. Except that didn't happen. The first film only contained oblique references to Dumbledore.
What makes Albus Dumbledore so fond of you?
Well, the second film did stuff like this. Here, Dumbledore stares into a mirror meant to show him his heart's desire, and he sees the face of Grindelwald looking back at him. Earlier in the film, when someone states that Dumbledore and Grindelwald were, quote, as close as brothers, Dumbledore interjects and says that they were closer than brothers. And that's it. Those are the only references to Dumbledore's gayness that we get. While those scenes clearly nod to Dumbledore's queerness, they are intentionally filmed to be open to interpretation, so that those who do not wish to see Dumbledore's gayness can simply ignore it. It's queerbaiting in prime form. Now, some argue that this type of representation is okay in this specific context. Firstly, some say that J.K. Rowling doesn't have to include queer representation in her work at all, so me complaining is just me trying to be offended. To that I say, J.K. Rowling was the one who brought it up. If she didn't want to show Dumbledore being gay, she 1. Shouldn't have said he was gay in the first place, and 2. Shouldn't have made films that directly focus on a storyline where his gay identity plays a major role. Secondly, some argue that, well, it's the 1920s. Yeah, it's the 1920s, see? Prohibition and stuff like that. I don't know much about the 1920s. Dumbledore wouldn't be an out and proud gay man in the 20s. So my argument to this is that may or may not be true. We don't really know what the wizarding world thought of the LGBT community at the time because, well, J.K. Rowling never addressed it. But considering that they elected a black woman to their highest political office in 1920s America, they do seem to be pretty progressive. But who knows? Additionally, Dumbledore doesn't have to be out for his gayness to be explicit. It's not like Dumbledore has to kiss Grindelwald in the middle of 1940s Times Square. The film features a brief flashback to Dumbledore and Grindelwald as kids. Why not show Dumbledore express his feelings or kiss Grindelwald in that scene? It would add to the emotional resonance of the film and further add to the stakes of the film's central conflict between Grindelwald and Dumbledore. And finally, some state that maybe it's actually J.K. Rowling's intention to showcase Dumbledore's gay identity in one of the future Fantastic Beasts movies. This may be true, but we can't know that, and we can only deal with what's right in front of us. And the Crimes of Grindelwald still leaves us with zero queer representation of actual consequence within the franchise. And honestly, I'm getting kind of tired of constantly being asked to be patient. Marvel executive Kevin Feige does the same thing with queer superheroes in the MCU. Wait your turn, we'll get to you, it'll happen eventually sometime within the next 10 years. It's honestly frustrating, condescending, and insulting. And the lack of queer representation in the Harry Potter franchise is very conspicuous. Throughout the series, Rowling has explored the dangers of allowing fascism to fester within a society. She does this through Voldemort's ideals of mudblood versus purebloods in the Harry Potter franchise, and Grindelwald's call for the extermination of the non-magical community in the Fantastic Beasts franchise. She also uses imagery and rhetoric of fascist ideologies in association with both Voldemort and Grindelwald. One could even argue that the entire Harry Potter and Wizarding World franchises are all about exploring the dangers of fascist ideology in a society. And in the real world, queer people are one of the primary victims of fascist ideologies. The pink triangle that we use to represent the LGBTQ community comes from the symbol that queer people had to wear in the Holocaust. Yet Rowling only places straight heroes at the center of her narratives. Even the not explicitly queer Dumbledore is intentionally sidelined in the fight against fascism by his queerness, due to him making a childhood magical pact with Grindelwald not to fight him. So to not have Dumbledore or any other person of a minority group play a major role in fighting fascism is extremely disappointing. And the biracial character Lita Lestrange doesn't count as good representation because she falls into the racist tragic mulatto trope. Take a look at how the X-Men franchise, which deals with similar ideas of fascism and prejudice, literally opens up in a Nazi concentration camp. We are given the character of Magneto, a Jewish Holocaust survivor. So through the rest of the movies, when Magneto speaks about prejudice, hate, and fascism, we can reflect on the real-world implications. This provides the story with true stakes and reminds us how a movie about mutants with insane superpowers can still be about something meaningful. On top of that, by ignoring both the victimhood of queer people in fascistic regimes, as well as our ability to take part in the eventual overthrow of fascistic rhetoric, Rowling erases the real-life fights that are too often won by the blood of those who have suffered the deepest. Rowling is under no obligation to include queer people, people of color, or people of faith in her fascism metaphor narratives of witches and wizards. But if J.K. Rowling wants to tell the story of the power of diversity over hatred, then it follows that her storyline should be, well, diverse. At the end of the day, despite all of this, I still consider J.K. Rowling to be a friend to the LGBTQ community. But as Dumbledore himself once said, it takes a great deal of bravery to stand up to our enemies, but just as much to stand up to our friends. Alright, that's it for Nerd Out. Whew, that was a lot. We started off with queerbaiting, got into some fascism, now I need to go to bed. Speaking of which, this is going to be the last Nerd Out of 2018. I know, don't worry, I'll be back in 2019 with even more episodes. And you can find those and all my previous Nerd Outs right here on pride.com or by following me on my YouTube channel @JesseGender. Until then, you've been nerding out.